Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the American Enterprise Institute, I want to welcome you to this discussion entitled Pay for Success, a New Approach to Funding Social Welfare Programs. I'm Arthur Brooks, President of the American Enterprise Institute, and what an honor to be with all of you and with our distinguished guests today. This event is co-sponsored by Save the Children and features two of my absolute favorite members of Congress, Representative John Delaney from Maryland, my congressman, and Todd Young from Indiana. Please join me in thanking them for joining us. Representatives Delaney and Young have, for the last two sessions of Congress, co-authored legislation intended to improve social and health interventions through the use of social impact bonds. Most of you are familiar with those, but if you're not, you're going to be very familiar with them by the end of today's session. I know both the congressmen personally, and I can attest to their desire to find innovative ways to better serve the most marginalized people in our country, something to which we are deeply, deeply dedicated here at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm so thankful for their leadership and their tireless work on behalf of people at the periphery of our society. Today, we will begin with statements from Congressman Delaney and then one by Congressman Young, and then we'll take questions from the audience, which I'll direct. After their question and answer session, we have a terrific panel which will discuss the Pay for Success idea, and then the event will close with remarks from Mark Shriver of Save the Children, who also happens to be my next door neighbor. This is, so we'll have a block association meeting afterward. Thank you so much to everyone who's here today, and especially to Representatives Delaney and Young for coming to AEI and for your important and courageous work on this issue.
Of AEI, and I want to thank everyone, all the team members at AEI for the terrific relationship I've enjoyed with what I think is a singular organization since I've been in Congress. The intellectual heft that you bring to these discussions is really incredibly helpful to members of Congress and for the larger debates we're having in this country about many important issues. It's always great here to be with my good friend Todd Young, who I think by any measure is one of the best members of Congress. He served our country even before his service in the Congress, and he's just a terrific colleague to work with. And I also want to thank my friend Mark Shriver. I don't quite see Mark. I know he's here because he's giving remarks. I saw him earlier. There he is. And your team at Save the Children for your sponsorship of this event. So Pay for Success or social impact bonds is an area that I've become very excited about since I first discovered them, which was around when I decided to run for Congress. And my perspective on this topic is informed by my prior career, which was in the private sector. And what I always observed in the private sector was when you see a situation where the government, the nonprofit community, private citizens, and the business community are working well together, when they're working collaboratively, when they're working towards common goals and for the common good of their communities, you typically get very good economic outcomes for all the citizens. You find that around this country, you find it around the world. When you see these various stakeholders really working together, you get good outcomes, and when you see them in opposition, you get bad outcomes. And that kind of larger framework informs a lot of the things I do in Congress, including my passion and interest in this subject matter. Because if you think about what's going on in the world right now, the world is changing very rapidly. The macro forces in the world, whether they be technological innovation, global interconnection, are driving truly transformative change in the face of our economy. They're benefiting many people. People have great educations, access to capital, things like that. But so many of our citizens are being left behind because of the pace of these changes. We have not quite prepared our population as well as we could have for this new world we live in. And in my opinion, there is a clear role for government to do that by making investments. And again, my experience in the private sector has taught me that you cannot make transformative changes in the world unless you're willing to invest. But the government has several problems right now associated with making investments. The first problem the government has is it's fiscally strained, whether at the federal level, many states, local governments, because of the Great Recession and some bad kind of business practices, if you will, across several decades. We find ourselves with budgets around this country that are not in the best shape, not ideal to making investments off of. Second problem the government has is it's not by any means, the perfect laboratory for innovation. If you look at what's happening outside of government, if you look at the kind of the innovation curve and how steep it is and what's occurring, and you compare that to what's happening in government, you always say to yourself, boy, I wish we could have some of that innovation in government. And it's not because people in government don't have the right intentions. It's not that they're not trying. It's just very hard for big enterprises to be innovative, and government is the ultimate big enterprise. And the other problem government has is it doesn't track results as effectively and efficiently as it could, because in fact, government is informed by politics. And politics is an art of hiding results sometimes, right? So, so you don't have that kind of transparency which creates that virtuous kind of cycle, if you will, that leads to better innovation and better results. So when you take a step back and if you look about what's going on in the world, it's changing rapidly. It's leaving a lot of people behind. We need to invest in a smart way, using innovative practices, and learn from these experiences and do better and better. That's what I think we need all across government to help people who are poor, to help people who are suffering from chronic health issues, to help people who don't have access to high-quality education, whatever the area may be. And that's where this framework, which is, to me is a very broad framework, pay for success social impact bonds, comes into play. Because what you do in this world is the government actually contracts for services, typically with nonprofits, typically in partnership with philanthropists or private investors, to make investments in innovative solutions, right, that can make a difference in people's lives, and the government only pays if results are achieved. And the framework that's put in place for these programs involve a lot of transparency and a lot of accountability. An example, a kind of a common example that I like to talk about is some programs that have been done around asthma. Asthma among children is the #1 reason kids miss school, and it costs us about $60 billion a year as a country to deal with children who have asthma who get hospitalized. And if any of you have children that have asthma or have had asthma, you know that if you are disciplined in following the procedures and taking your medications, you can live very successfully with asthma. But if you don't, you end up in the hospital. And if you look what's going on in a lot of the poor communities in this country, you find situations where kids are in the home, they're not taking their medicine, or asthma attacks are being triggered by common things like pet hair, insects, homes not being maintained or kept in a clean and appropriate manner that you would for a child with asthma. And so this has been a problem for a long time for government. They've tried to get the Medicaid population, which is the population of poor children that is getting their health care paid for by the government, who have asthma, to comply with the regimes they're supposed to follow, and they haven't been successful. But because of this form of contracting, pay for success, we've seen innovations where local governments have gone to nonprofits and said, why don't you take over the population of children that have asthma that are under the Medicaid, that are part of our Medicaid program? We're paying the bills, we can't get them to apply. Why don't you take over this population and see how you do? And the nonprofits come in with innovative solutions, and they invest in doing remediations in the home and other creative ways to get these kids to comply and their families to comply. They don't get paid anything unless they deliver results. So the way these contracts are structured is if in 5 years they can demonstrate that the population that they've managed has had a reduced hospital admissions rate related to asthma, the government will make them a one-time success payment that'll be calculated to be less than the government was paying otherwise. The way the nonprofits afford to make the investments that can potentially produce these results and get the success payment is by selling a social impact bond to an investor or a nonprofit who will invest, get involved, work with the nonprofit like a private equity investor would in a company, make sure the results are achieved, and if the success payment is made, the philanthropist receives a return on their investment, which they hopefully then can put in another social impact bond. So again, if you think about the problems that I think government has, lack of financial resources, lack of innovation, lack of metrics, all of those are solved with this form of contracting. And again, if you take a step back and if you think about so many of the very significant issues we have in this country that need to be addressed, early childhood education, there's pay for success frameworks that are successfully being put in place to allow the same type of relationships I described for asthma to happen with early childhood education. If you think about investments that need to be made in some of our cities, if you think about issues with criminal justice, recidivism among prisoners when they're released, if you think about healthcare issues of the poor, across the board, you see ways where you can bring the government, the private sector, private citizens, the nonprofit community, and philanthropists together to make a difference against this problem. The other thing I believe it'll do, if you think about what's happening in the world on a macro level, clearly a lot of wealth is being created for all the reasons I said earlier. Technological innovation, globalization, and the effect it's having on our economy. We talk about this all the time. Any smart ways policymakers can come up with to encourage more money to be invested in society, I think that ultimately alleviates a lot of the tension we're having today in terms of the larger discussion around income disparities and income inequalities. And if you think about the global pie chart of wealth, if you will, a relatively small slice of it right now is allocated towards philanthropy. So if you think about an asset allocation perspective, you have all the wealth in the world, you have a small slice that's philanthropic endeavors. If we can, because of efforts of many people in this room, continue to pioneer pay for success frameworks and social impact bonds, in other words, creating more ways for people to invest in society in ways that they feel comfortable that they have a role in managing and helping ensure a good outcome and can see those results. And then, in fact, they can get some of that capital back to reinvest a second time and a third time and a fourth time back in society. We can materially expand that allocation, if you will, that's right now going towards philanthropy and make a very big difference on a macro level. So it's for all these reasons I've been supportive of this effort. It's been terrific to work with Todd, who's been a pioneer in this area. Our legislation, which he'll probably touch on more, just really enables states and local governments to do what they're already doing. The federal government, like in many ways, is getting in the way of some of this innovation because of some arcane rules related to what state and local governments can do with federal money. And so we've had a lot of success in getting bipartisan support for that. But this is a big grassroots movement going on around this country that's been led by nonprofit leaders, philanthropists, and policymakers. And I applaud all of you in the room for doing this, people like Save the Children and Mark. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, I too thank Arthur and AEI, Save the Children. Thank all of you for being here today to hear me hold forth a bit on this initiative. It was Milton Friedman who said one of the biggest mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions as opposed to their results. And that's really why we're all here today, when you step back. That's what Pay for Success more broadly is about. That's what social impact bonds, if you will, are about. What we have restyled social impact partnerships, so that there's no confusion about the nature of these contracts. It's a network of contracts designed in the end to reward success, successful interventions to help the at-risk and marginalized members of our society. We're 50 years into the war on poverty, and we know that too many poor families, too many at-risk individuals continue to, generation after generation, not see marked improvements in their circumstances. And the programs that we have to serve these individuals, all well-intentioned, really aren't working. And we have a growing evidence base, or lack thereof, to indicate that they're not working. By some counts, there's roughly 95 different federal social support programs, depending upon how you count them. Only 10 of those have ever been rigorously studied, and I use the gold standard of evaluation to define rigorous there. Randomized controlled trial, multi-site. So out of those 95 programs, 10 have been studied. And only one, Early Head Start, was found to have any sort of meaningful change in the lives of recipients. And they're not even a significant change, but a noticeable change. So that tells me we need to change the entire system through which we serve these individuals. And so the social impact partnership model is a financing mechanism to do just that. You know, as I heard about this effort over the United Kingdom, it's really taking off. I wanted to learn more, so I visited the UK. Spent several days over there visiting government officials, Ian Duncan Smith, the not-for-profits who are implementing many of the interventions, those who put the money in, from foundations to some local governments to high-net-worth individuals. And the thing that most struck me about that visit was where so many of their interventions are coming from. They're coming from the United States of America. We have the most vibrant civil society in all of human history. Think of the 1830s, and Alexis de Tocqueville wrote extensively about voluntary associations, and it's a unique aspect of our culture. And so there's a growing evidence base on account of our ability at a fairly low cost to conduct controlled trials and longitudinal studies and other sorts of evidentiary collection. And so this evidence base is growing, and the UK and others are drawing on it. And we need to harness the things that we know are working in our local communities to meaningfully improve lives and actually achieve results. So that is what all of this is about. Our federal government, working together with our communities, ought to be seeing what's working in Indianapolis, Indiana, and Tallahassee, Florida, and trying to scale those things up among other populations in other geographies, using private capital to do so. And that's going to take a systemic sort of change. It's going to take a different way of thinking about some of these challenges, and also a different way of talking about them. We can no longer superficially sort of divide ourselves into two parties when we discuss these serving at-risk individuals. I spent the last few years on the Ways and Means Committee, and candidly, we often have sort of empty, vacuous debates within the Human Resources Subcommittee about funding levels. One side, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, but one side will oftentimes reduce this conversation, the debates we have, into using funding levels as a proxy for moral responsibility vis-a-vis the taxpayer. The other side will talk about funding levels as a proxy for moral responsibility vis-a-vis the recipients. So we measure compassion based on the amount of inputs, based on the amount of money we throw into a problem as opposed to the results achieved. And so that's what we're trying to move away from. If we shift the focus to results, if we figure out exactly what we want to accomplish in individualized circumstances, among identified populations within a certain geography, then that provides real opportunities here, not just to transform lives, but also, as John said, to help us save money in the process. So the Social Impact Partnership Act, which is what John and I have led on, is a way for the federal government to change conversation, to change the focus to outcomes as opposed to inputs where it belongs. It empowers, more specifically, localities, states, not-for-profits, and the private sector to engage in a network of contracts where they come together, they agree upon what those outcomes are, exactly when they have to be reached, what the payment schedule will be for success, intermediate payments, long-term payments, and so forth. And we only pay for results. We only pay for success. And you know what else is elegant about this? We learn from results. We learn from good implementations. We learn from positive results. We also learn from what I call suboptimal results. I don't call them failures. You see, I've done a little studying in economics, like so many in this room, and markets only work under certain circumstances. They only work perfectly when you have three conditions met. When you have perfectly rational consumers. When you have perfect competition. and when you have a perfect source of information, when you have perfectly informed consumers. Now, we're not able to harness all of those into creating a complete new market in the social realm here, but we are able to mimic a market of sorts here through this legislative effort, and I think it's something we can improve upon. Government bureaucrats, well-intentioned government bureaucrats, have a habit, and political appointees and politicians, to be fair, we have a habit when we do have successful results of spiking the football. We'll cut a ribbon, we'll issue press releases, we'll hold press conferences, but what happens when we achieve suboptimal results? It's either a Friday news dump or you never hear about it. You sweep it under the rug. We lose such an opportunity to learn, to improve upon an implementation. If you have an evidence-based practice that is working in Sacramento, California, and it's not, the implementation somehow was suboptimal in Indianapolis, Indiana, what happened there? Well, folks in Dayton, Ohio just might want to know. And so we provide in our legislation a clearinghouse for this information so that we can iteratively improve upon each of these implementations, just as I used to be a management consultant, just as a good management consultant would do. You have a template that works in a given organization. You adapt that template to a different organization or entity located elsewhere, and you continuously improve upon it. Our legislation creates a mechanism to do that. So this will improve the lives of recipients. This cycle that we've been able to create will benefit the investors, primarily philanthropic investors, I would anticipate in the beginning, but I would like your sober-minded, unapologetic capitalists to see this as an opportunity to diversify their portfolio. And you know what? We're capturing interest among that set as well. So after decades of Washington telling our communities, telling our low-income populations, this is how we will serve you, our one-size-fits-all programs, it's time we try something different. This is a systemic change. To my knowledge, it's the only initiative to change how we do social support in this country in a revolutionary way. I hope it catalyzes something very big, and we're going to require all of your help, the amplification of this effort to other members of Congress, your authoring pieces about this to help generate more support on the Hill and to get this thing done, hopefully in the coming year. Thanks for having us. I look forward to questions as well.
We have a few minutes for questions before the congressmen have to go back to the Hill. I'd like to start by saying this is optimistic. It's a wonderful initiative, something that we're proud of to be hosting this event here at AEI. Also, I'm noting, given the fact that today is the day that I get one of my son's report cards, that it's not an F, it's a suboptimal result. First question from out in the audience, right here, ma'am. Actually, and the ground rules are always the same at AEI. Please stand up, say who you are and your organization, and put your protest statement in the form of a question.
Okay. Hi, my name is Cheryl Buford. I am with Signature Impact Consulting now. I used to work for the Institutional Religious Freedom Alliance. I have a question for each of you. For Congressman Delaney, in the asthma efforts that you were talking about and the successful outreach of nonprofits, I'm wondering if there was any work done on how the percentage of nonprofits that were faith-based or churches, either a faith-based nonprofit or a church. And I have a question for Representative Young, and I'm wondering, when you went to the UK and you talked about the innovation being from the US, were you talking about innovation of evaluation or innovation in programs?
So in terms of whether faith-based organizations were specifically involved in the asthma situation that I described, the answer is no, not that I'm aware of. But I think faith-based organizations obviously play a very important role here. If you think about the players in a pay-for-success contract framing, you start with the government, who's putting out an RFP, if you will, for this type of relationship. In other words, formulating a framework. And that's one of the things, as Todd mentioned, our legislation does, which is effectively put in place a way for best practices to get better organized around the country so that local governments can access, oh, how do you do an asthma deal? Okay, here are the documents, et cetera, because it's pretty complicated stuff. And you worry the governments will get ripped off, right? So you want to actually have them have good advisors. So the local government is one player, and then they put out an RFP, and then typically a nonprofit will respond to the RFP. It's a nonprofit that has either had a lot of experience in this area, which could be a faith-based community, right? Around this country, you could see faith-based communities being involved in dealing with this population, the Medicaid population in a lot of ways, and maybe asthma in particular. Or it could be another nonprofit that's done a lot of work and research trying to innovate better solutions for the community in question. And then the investors. The investors will fall into a couple of different categories. They're mostly, as Todd said, philanthropists and nonprofits, which I think is great because I think everyone feels better when they're the investors, because you get the sense that no one's eating better steak or lobster on the backs of Medicaid kids with asthma, right? But it could also be for-profit investors, and I have no issue with that, but I think the market has to evolve before it's really efficient, because most of the people who are doing this to put the money in, but also to actually produce a better outcome. And if they knew they could get the better outcome, they'd give the money full stop probably. But clearly faith-based organizations, a lot of them have pools of capital where they make investments, et cetera. But I tend to see more of the faith-based participants as the operators who may be running and engaging some of the programs.
Thank you. And wouldn't our federal government be so much less expensive if we just offered lobster or steak to those who could actually reduce the incidence of asthma in low-income communities? But I agree with you. I certainly. In answer to your question, in short, the programmatic sort of things would have been taken from the United States and transplanted over to the UK. May also be some of the rigorous studies. I'm unaware of that. Since you asked about the United Kingdom, I could perhaps enlarge the question a bit and relate something to you that I didn't expect when I went over to the UK, and it was that we visited some local governments, and we found out that Social Finance UK, for example, one of the implementers of these initiatives, they are able to attract investment capital. They actually oversee projects and scaling up various interventions to, for example, reduce recidivism. And they have taken, through the incentive of market forces, to going around and looking at the books of municipal governments and see what the real cost drivers are, where there might be a market opportunity for them to reduce costs by improving lives. So this has truly become organically, it becomes a bottom-up effort driven by capitalist impulses and incentives. People work with government to identify ways to solve problems, and I didn't really anticipate that until I saw it in action in the UK.
We have really time for one more. They look really mellow, but their staff is getting really stressed out. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go over to this table here, and I'm sorry. And if we have more questions, we're going to hold them because we've got a sensational panel and plenty of time to answer these questions later.
Thank you. Sharon McRoder from the National Governors Association. So thank you for coming, and we're doing some work in this area, and so I would like to hear a little bit more about what your legislation does for the governors, for states. What barriers does it remove? How does it really help the states move this forward?
So I'll say a few things. I'll let Todd throw in. One of the things it does is eliminates a barrier. Right now, it's hard if a local government, whether it be a state or a local government, is actually using federal funds in a particular area. It's very hard to do these type of programs right now. So where you've seen this innovation, it's mostly been with programs that are just funded by the state or county, et cetera. And you know, as someone who represents governors, federal money gets mixed in with state and local money a lot in this country, right? It's actually one of the good models we have. The federal government puts up money, the states have to match it, you let the states run the show, et cetera. But we've put limitations on their ability to do these type of programs. So our legislation lifts that. It also actually sets aside $300 million of additional capital, and I think there's some talk of that being increased based on some conversations that I know Todd's had. And that money can be used to help pay for research that states and local governments need to put these programs in place, if you will, grants. And there's a bunch of standards. I'll let Todd talk about some of those so he can have part of the question as well. And then the money can also be used to actually buy some of the bonds. So if you have a program, it's like any kind of a business deal. Sometimes you need a, quote, anchor investor. So if a state were to structure a program in, say, asthma, like I talked about, where they outsource the population, they bring in a nonprofit, the nonprofit has to invest, sells bonds to get the capital, and then if they hit their numbers, the state makes the success payment to them. The federal government can actually buy the bonds or guarantee return on the bonds to kind of prime the pump on the program. So, I don't know, you can round it out there.
So the question was, how does this help the states, really? In short, this gives state legislators, this gives our governors, even mayors of major municipalities more discretion to offer personalized, localized services tailored to the needs of their citizens, and then to be held accountable. And it also creates a mechanism by which it brings the notion of laboratories of democracy into the 21st century, so that those laboratories become more vibrant, and we create a clearinghouse where all of their lessons learned can be shared and learned from, and we can iteratively improve upon these various interventions.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Representatives Delaney and Young. Stick around, everybody. It's a big show coming up. We're going to set up our panel right now, so please don't leave. Right up here, and it's going to be led by Catherine Stevens from AEI, and we're going to follow that with Mark Shriver. So the next hour is going to be great.
She's gonna
Yeah, that's right. Sorry.
So, are we going to speak? How are we going to speak? Are we going to speak at the podium or?
No, no, no,
seat?
no. Unless you want to. Is that okay? Yeah.
So that's fine.
I don't think so. No, I don't.
That's good. Can I have you up here soon? Yes. Thanks. Delaney,
everybody. Thank you so much for coming today to what I think is a really outstanding event with the representatives were outstanding, and our panel is extraordinary as well. I'm Catherine Stevens. I'm lead AEI's Early Childhood Program. Our panel are all leading experts in this field. You have their bios. It would take me 15 minutes to recite them. So I'm going to introduce them simply by their name and their affiliation, and then they can tell you more about the work they're doing when they speak. Next to me is John Barron. He is Vice President of Evidence-Based Policy for the Arnold Foundation. He was formerly a longtime president of the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy, which he founded in 2001. Next is Jeremy Keel, who is Managing Director of the Sorensen Impact Center at University of Utah's Business School, which focuses on developing innovative data-driven approaches to tough social problems. Next is George Overholser, who co-founded Third Sector Capital Fund in 2010 to develop innovative financing and contracting across public and private sectors, and Tracy Palangian, who co-founded U.S. Social Finance in 2011 and is CEO of the organization. So thank you all very, very much for being here. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have. I'd like to begin by asking each of you to speak for a few minutes about your work and what you find especially valuable and exciting about the Pay for Success approach, what you see it as bringing to the table. Tracy, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go this way.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, and to AEI for having us here. It's wonderful to be with my fellow travelers. We've been together at this, building the sector for the last 5 years, and it's just been amazing, especially John's work around evidence-based policymaking. It really underpins all of our work in Pay for Success. It's remarkable sitting here in this room now, 5 years into this movement. As I think about when we got started, Social Finance was formed in January of 2011 to bring the UK model that Congressman Young talked about. Social Finance UK, our sister organization, pioneered this new kind of public-private partnership model to draw more resources for effective programs. And to think about the arc over the last 5 years, very few concepts in social programs have gone from conception to reality so quickly. I'd love to just offer a few reflections. When we got started, we're a nonprofit, a relatively small nonprofit. My partner Navjeet Bal is over there. We're now 35, strong and growing. We're this small nonprofit with a great ambition of injecting innovation and accountability in the public sector. A lot of the remarks that Congressman Delaney talked about, as well as rethinking how finance can be in service of society. And those were big ambitions. And we have this little tool, the social impact bond, the Pay for Success model, to bring to this country to see if we might make it work, addressing a wide variety of social issue areas. There was a lot of experimentation in the early days. George and I used to knock on doors of governors and mayors to tell them about this model. And 5 years into this, you know, the kind of mainstream interest and adoption, not least represented by all of you guys in this room, it's just been incredible. So a quick word on where the field is today. 5 years into this movement, we have 50 projects having launched in 5 countries, spanning a whole set of issue areas from criminal justice to addressing health disparities, addressing educational opportunities, et cetera, workforce development. Social Finance, UK, US, and Israel, we're a global platform of 3 sister organizations. We've launched 15 projects, and those are also fantastically diverse. The United States, and Catherine's fantastic document, I really urge you to read it, highlights the 8 projects that have launched in the United States, in this country, representing the largest market in dollar terms globally. So a lot of excitement around this model. And so I'm not going to go through the 8 projects that you can see on the sheet at the table, but I'd rather like to talk about a few projects that our team is working on that you may not be able to read in the newspaper yet. One of the most exciting things is that in the coming weeks, we'll be announcing a project with Governor Haley's administration in South Carolina, launching a project statewide to provide low-income, Medicaid-eligible first-time moms with the support tools that they can have a healthy pregnancy and have the baby have successful early childhood outcomes. We're incredibly excited about this project. It's going to be, again, announced in a few weeks. A couple of projects which are more workforce development based is also something that I'm very excited about. A project in Massachusetts, we're working with Governor Charlie Baker to bring vocational training and adult basic education to a population so that they can become more fully skilled, more fully employed, so that they can have the opportunity to really flourish and reach their potential. We're also working on a project with the veteran population. This is with recent folks coming back home from military service, and a really neat program that's about providing both employment support as well as addressing their acute mental health challenges like PTS, so that they can have a holistic set of services. And it's incredible. Gone through a couple of RCTs, John. Compared to the status quo program, which is vocational rehab, when you're returning military service member, you get vocational rehab. The program is having a 2.5 times effect size, if you will, of people getting jobs and staying in those jobs. We're working with a really exciting and progressive government in Connecticut, keeping families together and avoiding children to get sent to Department of Children's Families, to get placed in a foster home or a congregate home. So incredible diversity, and we're really excited about the potential. Catherine asked me about kind of the strengths of the model and the merits. I think it's very clear to all of you, especially the Congressmen remarks, that the feature of the win-win-win, which by the way is such a rare thing in today's political economy, is obvious to all of you. The win-win-win being that government only pays for results, gains accountability for taxpayer funds. These incredible high-performing nonprofits with a great evidence base get a very different kind of capital, flexible capital to expand services to help more people. And then investors, whether they're philanthropic or as Congressman Young talked about, more mercenary, if you will, are seeing a new way to deploy their investment capital to achieve a double bottom line. So this win-win-win is obviously obvious to you all. So I'd like to just briefly mention a couple of features which I think are less obvious, less intuitive. First, Pay for Success works best when we're targeting our society's most vulnerable, the most marginalized. It may not be intuitive, but when we work with those communities and those individuals, the economics are actually the most compelling. So that's number one. Number two, this private funding is incredibly flexible. What does flexibility in funding means? It encourages innovation, use of data, continually adapting the program and make sure that you're achieving your outcomes. Three, as the Congressman mentioned, under Pay for Success, these social programs are not perpetual. We will have a study that will learn, did we meet the metrics? Did we not meet the metrics? And naturally, a project would sunset if the metrics are not achieved, what they call suboptimal results, which is incredible because so many of the programs that we see are go on year after year without kind of measurement and the demonstration of results. And then finally, and this is something so close to our hearts at our team, when we work on Pay for Success projects, we talk a lot about design, the upfront putting together the best project possible, but the ongoing focus, ongoing engagement of all the parties, that sustained engagement over 5 years, 6 years, sometimes 8 years of this project's life is really where the rubber meets the road and where all the results is seeing. So despite all these things, what's there not to love, right? All these fantastic merits. I think my colleagues would agree with me that this work is so hard. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. In theory, it's a win-win-win thing. It's a beautiful thing. I think in practice, it gets really complicated. putting together these multi-stakeholder contracts, articulating these outcomes, doing the math behind it, designing the right evaluation, having the right operational plan on the ground, expose these complexities. And sometimes these stakeholders have divergent priorities. And so, you know, we're humbled by the interest, but we're also humbled by the challenges that we have yet to solve. But I have to tell you, 5 years into this, I remain ever so optimistic about the tool's potential to change lives, to change government, and get more results for our communities.
Great. Thanks so much, Tracy. George?
You have spoken my heart, Tracy. Thank you. There's so many things to say, but I'll just relate a story about the progress that we're seeing, which I'm going to repeat some of the things that Tracy said because we've lived a parallel experience. It's uncanny, actually. But it was 2007 when I first pitched this concept or something very similar to it to a room with maybe twice this large. And at the end, there was this little kind of smattering of applause. Sitting next to me was Mark Warner, who had recently finished his job as governor of Virginia. And while people were clapping politely, he leans over into my ear and he says, "George, don't even try. It'll never work." And I said, "Oh, thank you, Mark." And I tried to smile. He's since come around, and he's actually, I think, been very supportive of this. But the reason he said this is because government is very, very difficult to work with in terms of getting change to happen. So it's all the more amazing that we've made the progress that we have. Why is it happening, you might ask? And I would say that most fundamentally what's going on here is an information revolution that is finally reaching government after so many years. Follow this guy. He is, as Tracy said, John is the guy who first inspired me to really dig in on this because of his research. And we are having a social sciences revolution right now. The cost of knowing what works and what doesn't work has dropped by a factor of more than 10. And that's making it possible for the first time to actually do something that we probably always wanted to do, which is to have a feedback loop on our government outlays towards social well-being. Just a quick survey of the work that third sector is doing. We have about 20 projects in development around the country in various stages. I won't even begin to go through all of them, but what is interesting is they are touching on a wide array of social issues. So we have child welfare projects, we have recidivism projects, we have projects in the what we sometimes call duly involved youth, which is young people who are in both foster care system and in the justice system. We have mental health projects of various types, and the list goes on and on. And what they all have in common is they are what you might say newly measurable. It's now become possible to track the outcomes for these very vulnerable populations and to ask the question, were we able to make a difference? So to speak a little bit about the social impact bond and how it's a different thing than pay for success. So pay for success, we've talked about. Government either pays or does not pay based on outcomes. The social impact bond is a financing mechanism. It says private people put money up front to pay for the programs so that when you finally, so basically they can be paid for while you wait to see what happens later on. And I always say that when we talk about this because sometimes people get confused. Of those two innovations, I'll say that the one I'm particularly excited about is pay for success. And there are really two main reasons. Let's say three. Reason number one, overwhelmingly, government is what pays for the programs that we have in place in our society that are intended to improve people's well-being. Philanthropy is this big compared to government. And the whole pay for success approach does two things. One, more obvious than the other. The more obvious thing is that we can prompt a reallocation of resources. And John is the source of that quote that we heard from Representative Young about only 1 out of 10 government, federal spending streams that had been comprehensively studied, was able to show systematically measurable outcomes. He leaned over and said, what's the new? It's now 11 out of 12, I think, failed to show strong outcomes. So what that says to me is, and what Representative Young didn't say, is that for each of these, there were successes within the total. It's just, as a whole, there wasn't strong outcomes. So what we have is a huge opportunity to reallocate our resources away from the programs that aren't serving our communities well enough and towards those that are poised to scale and already are serving programs. So the answer is right there. We just need a mechanism to prompt the reallocation. But the less intuitive aspect of pay for success has to do with innovation. And I was a newcomer to the way government works, and now I feel like I understand it better. And what I would say is that every time you write a law, it tends to freeze into place a recipe. So 15, 20, 30 years ago, someone saw a program that they liked, and they said, you know what, this is a great program. It ought to be scaled. Let's write it up, and then let's make sure that people really have high fidelity to the model, and make sure that that's written into the law too. And then we'll only pay if people follow the recipe. And I'm oversimplifying, but there's a lot of that going on in the way we do laws. And the joke I like to tell is, if we did music the same way, we would all be listening to Meatloaf on an 8-track recording machine. Because 30 years ago, someone would have said, that is great music technology. There ought to be a law. Let's scale this up and make it available to everyone. And they would have said, however, it has to be good music, good technology. So unless it's 8-track, no funding. And then it gets put into a law, and the regulations are written all around it, layer upon layer. And no one can ever change the darn thing. So the real ultimate power of pay for success is not kind of incrementally finding a program that's a little bit better than the other and reallocating, which is really very powerful, but it's more embarking down this long-term march of progress. So that you have the 8-track, followed by the cassette deck, followed by the boom box, followed by the compact disc, and so on and so on and so on, step by step, the improvements that lead to the glorious Spotify and Rhapsody that we enjoy today. It makes me very optimistic that the work that we're all doing here together is actually going to bring about measurable improvements to people's lives in a very big way. If you look at all the other sectors, or not all of them, but many of the other sectors, take cancer, for example. You see the systematic boom, 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 gets better and better and better over time. But when you look at poverty, it's flat. When you look at our educational outcomes, it's flat over 30-year time periods. And I think what we're going to do is watch that curve bend, and it's just extremely exciting to me. Finally, I'll say the federal legislation, the feds have an important role to play. The work that we do is with states and counties. They are driving the bus.
Except for our veterans work, potentially.
Okay, that's a federal program, which is great. But most of what happens more locally. But the feds can do things that make it a lot easier on the local end. And that includes relaxing the compliance constraints that take every spending stream and say, for example, you can only spend this money this year, you can't obligate in the future, and it can't be contingent. It's against the law to be contingent if you want to use any federal dollars. That would be an example. That can be relaxed. Also, the funding of feasibility studies, that's part of the legislation that you heard about earlier, is highly, highly catalytic, because governors and counties don't have the budget they need to be able to invest in that first step down the road. It's a very small investment price to pay, which then unleashes really very large flows of money that can be moved to much higher purpose. So I see my time's up, so I'm not going to keep going, but thanks so much for having us, and thank you everyone for being interested.
Thanks so much, George. Jeremy?
Thank you. It's great to be here. I was trying to think of a good analogy to impress upon you sort of the caliber of my co-panelists. And I came up with like a basketball analogy. So this is like the equivalent for me of going to a pickup game with Steph Curry, LeBron James, and Kobe Bryant when Kobe Bryant was still good. This is a huge pleasure for me to be here. And Catherine Stevens, who like in the very short time that she's been on the scene has become just sort of one of the preeminent thought leaders in the social impact space. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So I run a center at the University of Utah called the Sorensen Impact Center that focuses very broadly on social impact and social innovation, pay for success being one of the sort of key themes or models that we're exploring and working on, mainly in the western half of the country, although in other places as well. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes, and actually I should say by way of introduction, I was in government, a senior advisor to the mayor of a county when we first implemented a pay for success transaction in early education, which was the first in the country on that, in that issue area. So I have some experience coming at this from government as well. I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about sort of the 5 or 6 things that I find really, really compelling about pay for success. And I'm quick to add that I am no apologist for, I'm not an apologist for anything, but particularly not a financial model that is by and large unproven and untested. But I am an apologist in some ways for so many of the elements or components of these transactions, of these projects, because they are, as you heard from the Congressman today, really pretty revolutionary, in particular when you're contextualizing this in the work of state and local governments and the federal government to affect social change. So just a couple of these things, and some of this you've heard already, but Congressman Delaney hammered on this theme of multi-sector collaboration. And from my perspective, this is sort of solving a disconnect, a historical disconnect that we've lived with, which is that some of these really, really challenging social problems that we're talking about, homelessness in particular, but others, really sort of hollow out or gut society in a really fundamental way and affect every stratus or every stratum of society, every government agency, every sector. And yet the disconnect has been that we sort of assume that it's kind of the nonprofits and government's responsibility to solve those problems. The other sectors of society have largely remained on the sidelines and been frustrated at the lack of progress. So this is a real opportunity to bring all of those stakeholders together, really for the first time, to my knowledge, and have them sort of collectively focus on not only the problem, but understanding the population that they're trying to serve. The real, using data to actually understand that population, what the needs, the risks, the challenges of that population are, the cost of that population to society writ large. I think that's a powerful, revolution or development in its own right. I would also point out this sort of refreshing, focus in the social sector on outcomes and results and measurement, which, as we pointed out, the other guests have pointed out, just historically has not really been there in the social sector in the way it has been in other disciplines. And tying funding to those outcomes, to those long-term kind of stretch outcomes that we want to see in the community, ensures that people will actually care about the results. I had an interesting conversation with the deputy mayor of a very large city in the country the other day, and she said, we've been doing rigorous program evaluation for ages. She said, but until Pay for Success came around, nobody cared about the results because there was no funding tied to it. And she sort of famously described this really rigorous RCT that they had done in this government. And she said at the end of the 4-year measurement period, she was literally the only person that checked in on the results, and it was just more out of curiosity than anything else. And Pay for Success sort of solves that because you have a lot riding on whether that outcome was achieved or not. You've got stakeholders who have a vested interest and opposed interest sitting on opposite sides of the table watching that result very, very carefully. I think that's real progress. Rigorous independent evaluation of programs, and I'm going to let John talk about this because that's sort of his specialty, but I will just say this, program evaluation is grossly underfunded. One of my sort of main, one of the drums that I'm beating constantly, in particular with funders, is that you guys talk a good game about paying for success and paying for outcomes, and yet you haven't been willing very often to sort of build the capacity of service providers to play at that level for one thing. And then the other thing is to sort of be willing to write checks to fund program evaluations to establish whether these things are working or not. But can't overemphasize the importance of really sort of shining a spotlight in a very dark place and trying to understand, does something work, does it not? Okay, now we've got a data point to go on in one direction or the other, but at least we've got some data and a clearer picture starting to emerge. The other thing about the model that I like a lot is that it sort of creates this virtuous virtuous rise to the top, if you will, among service providers. You're really selecting for providers that have at least a preliminary, basis of evidence, a preliminary level of evidence in their program, and you're pushing providers along that evidence continuum. You're saying, okay, you may be here right now, and you think you're getting good results, but to play in the big time, you've got to have multi-site randomized control trials, whatever it is, and you're effectively pushing the entire sector along that continuum, which is just a really, really virtuous, good thing to have happen. Nonprofit providers and social entrepreneurs and others are finding out that case management anecdotes and reports out on activities and outputs, inputs, short-term indicators of success, that's not working as well as it used to. Funders that we're talking to are starting to say, okay, I don't care, it's great that you helped, John Smith, and isn't that great for him, but I want to look at your data. I want to understand how you are sort of very broadly changing outcomes in this community in a very systemic way. And that's a very high bar for providers, and but yet it's exactly the kind of thing that probably needs to happen in the sector. Just one last thing I would mention is that because the model depends on articulating a really compelling value proposition for government or whoever the kind of back-end payer is, whoever's going to pay that upfront investor back, it really sort of favors programs and interventions that can intervene further upstream in the value chain, if you will, or further upstream in the life cycle of a social problem. And so you get a lot of programs that get funded through Pay for Success where, instead of funding the jail bed, you're talking about funding the behavioral health treatment or the mental health treatment, or the workforce development program that's going to keep somebody in a stable job and out of jail. And from my perspective, that's the right order of things, right? I mean, government has historically played this very kind of provider of last resort role, where we build jails and prisons and hospitals and homeless shelters and emergency departments, because government has to step in at that point because the problem has become so acute and nobody else will. I think we all get that. What if government could intervene at a more efficient inflection point in that life cycle of a problem? It's not bigger government, but it's just more efficient government. And I think Pay for Success, because of this sort of focus on, an ounce of prevention being better than a pound of cure, Pay for Success has a really powerful ability to kind of, force that. Maybe one last thing I would just mention really quickly is that the really difficult funding decisions that we all know that government needs to make around, when they learn that a program doesn't in fact work, there's sort of this moral or ethical responsibility on the part of the policymaker to reallocate resources towards someone else, right? It'd be different if we had infinite resources and we could just use those resources however we want. But in an era or an environment of limited resources, we really have to be sure that where we're spending our money, we're getting the biggest impact or the biggest effect. The problem is that policymakers are not very good at, recognizing failure. I think Congressman Delaney pointed that out. And then making the really, really tough calls to reallocate resources towards something else. The reason is because, political champions, stakeholders, others come out of the woodwork and try to protect that program. And I saw this firsthand the other day in a jurisdiction that we're working with. They had created a program in a community which was basically like computer labs in really poor communities around the city. Which was a great idea in the 90s, right? When you were talking about the technological divide and poor people not having access to tech, not being able to create a job resume, et cetera, et cetera. So this jurisdiction created these computer labs all over the place. The problem is now everybody has their own technology. Nobody's using this thing. The only people that go in there are a couple of teenagers to play video games, occasionally. And so this policymaker that we were advising on this initiative, this was the executive, he brought this to his legislative body and said, guys, this doesn't make sense anymore. Let's cut this. And there was not one stakeholder from the community that actually used the service that came to testify, but the employees of the computer labs came to testify. And they said, well, this is my job, and you're taking away my livelihood. And that legislative body chickened out, and that program remains on the books. It's very, very hard to get these programs off the books once they're on there. Pay for Success has that cutoff mechanism hardwired in. If a program doesn't work, it very visibly doesn't work, and the program gets shut down as a result of it. Lots more to say. My time's out. Again, lots of challenges. It's difficult, as Tracy and George have both indicated, like tons of headaches, like brain damage, banging your head against a wall, trying to get these things done. But at the end of the day, I think it's sort of the leading edge of a revolution in the social sector, which I think is greatly needed. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. John?
Well, it's great to be here on this panel with folks, the people who are leading this movement, and essentially are entrepreneurs who are trying to create something out of nothing, a new way of funding effective programs within government. So let me mention that the Arnold Foundation is funding a number of Pay for Success projects around the country. In New York and Ohio and elsewhere. We're also funding some of the infrastructure at the Urban Institute and Social Impact Bond Laboratory and elsewhere to try to advance this approach more broadly. That work is being headed up by our Sustainable Public Finance Division that's led by my colleague Josh McGee at the Foundation. I'm going to talk about the problem that Pay for Success is designed to address in a little bit more detail than we've heard, which is that in general in U.S. social spending at the federal level and the state level, government funds are not allocated on the basis of evidence about what works, and therefore, in many areas, are not achieving the hoped-for effects. For most large federal and state social programs, but let me talk federal here, such as Head Start, Title I at the Department of Education, Job Corps, the Job Training Partnership Act, the Workforce Investment Act now. In those programs, the federal government more or less plays the role of a faucet, meaning that Congress has directed the federal agencies to allocate large streams of funding to state and local organizations, sometimes through a formula, sometimes through competition, but where evidence about which state and local activities are effective or not effective plays very little role in what gets funded. Studies have shown that in many instances, that funding stream, that faucet-type approach to social spending has not achieved the hoped-for effects. So Congressman Young mentioned this. I'll update the numbers a little bit. But as he mentioned, since 1990, there have been now 12 instances in which whole federal programs like Head Start and Upward Bound at the Department of Education and Job Corps at the Department of Labor and Youth Corps at CNCS have been evaluated using a large randomized controlled trial, which is considered the most credible evaluation method. 11 of those studies found that the program being evaluated, that funding stream, produced weak or no positive effects. In other words, those not enrolled in the program did about as well over time as those who were enrolled. Now, as George pointed out, very importantly, that does not mean that every state and local activity or intervention that receives funding from these programs is ineffective. That's not true. In fact, there is evidence that some state and local and nonprofit activities, I'll give you an example in a moment, that receive funding from these government programs are effective. But what these studies did was they measured the average impact across the program, so that the impact from the effective activities is diluted out by the many others that are not effective. So let me give you an example of a government-funded state and local intervention that is highly effective. This is a study that came out recently. It's New York City's small schools of choice. So in the early 2000s, under the Bloomberg administration, New York started shutting down its large, low-performing high schools in high-poverty areas and replacing them with much smaller high schools that were competitively selected and where students in New York had a choice. There was an element of school choice in which school they were going to attend. So this citywide intervention was evaluated in a very large randomized controlled trial conducted by MDRC, where 20,000 students were either lotteried into one of these small schools or lotteried out. They got the traditional public high school. And that study just reported its 6-year findings. It found that students in the low, given access to the smaller schools, had a rate of graduating high school and enrolling in college the next year that was 6 to 8 percentage points higher than the students in the larger schools. And that was done at no additional cost compared to traditional high schools, because there was less grade retention, so the kids in the small schools weren't hanging around for a 5th year in high school. Now that's an instance of validated effectiveness. The problem, as I mentioned, is that those instances are not prioritized within federal funding or, in most cases, state funding. In other words, Title I, for example, at the Department of Education does not pay any attention to whether a program, a specific approach like this, works or doesn't work, and then seeks to expand it. In general, the problem is that in government social spending, there's no systematic mechanism in place to rigorously test new interventions like that, or when instances of effectiveness are found, to put them into widespread use. And that is the great promise, the great problem that Pay for Success seeks to address, that it allows government funds and supplemented with private funds to go toward, to be allocated on the basis of what works in a credible way. So let me briefly conclude here by outlining 3 items that we believe are essential ingredients to Pay for Success projects in order for them to work. One, as has been discussed here, there needs to be a credible method for evaluating the impact, the effectiveness of Pay for Success projects. The most credible method is a well-conducted randomized controlled trial. And unlike other methods, apart from its scientific rigor, unlike other methods, it is the kind of method that cannot be easily gamed, either consciously or unconsciously, by the evaluator to produce a desired result. In other words, the random assignment is done, the evaluator and the program is stuck with a group of kids who are in the treatment group, some are in the control group, and then the outcomes come out where they come out. The high school graduation rate is either higher for the treatment than the control group, or it's not. And that may be the outcome that the evaluator and the program wants, or it may not be. So it is a credible method, and as George alluded to, they can be done in many instances, not all at reasonable cost. We have a new initiative, a funding initiative announcement that's out. Our foundation is funding randomized controlled trials between $100,000 and $300,000. And we're making significant investments in that area. Secondly, the second ingredient, and I think this is the biggest challenge and maybe the biggest threat to the success of Pay for Success. Our suggestion is that Pay for Success projects, the way they're designed, the way they're put in legislation and so on, focus on interventions for which there is highly credible prior evidence suggesting a positive impact is likely to be found. And the reason we suggest focusing on instances where prior evidence is either highly promising or strong is that most interventions don't work. I mean, that is a compelling finding when rigorous evaluations are done across many different fields. I mentioned a few in social spending, but it's true in other fields like medicine and business. Jim Manzi wrote a book a couple years ago where he reported that Google and Microsoft have conducted 13,000 randomized controlled trials of different business strategies over the past few years, 80 to 90% of which found no significant effect. In Manzi's words, innovative ideas rarely work. So that's true in medicine, it's true in business, it's true in social spending. So we strongly encourage the focus of pay-for-success projects on interventions where there is a strong reason to believe, based on prior evidence, that a meaningful impact is likely to be found. Otherwise, it's possible at the end of the day to have a lot of unhappy funders and really not to solve the problem that was hoped would be addressed. The biggest threat, in other words, is wishful thinking. I mean, to put it in one sentence. And the third item I'd like to mention, and final item, as I'm bumping up against 10 minutes here, is that the way that pay-for-success projects sometimes are structured in government, sometimes in legislation, is that they require not just an impact on an important outcome like child maltreatment or high school graduation or improving employment and earnings, but they also require, in addition to that, that there be net savings to the government. Having reviewed hundreds of rigorous evaluations, some of which found positive effects, our organization has reviewed. That is a very tall order, probably too tall in most areas, not only to produce an impact, but also to produce savings. It means that pay-for-success probably can succeed in certain areas, like interventions that will reduce foster care placements or hospitalizations or incarcerations where there's tangible savings. But how about other interventions like effective job training programs that increase people's employment and earnings, or effective educational programs that increase math scores, reading scores? Those, it's very hard to make a case without a lot of creative accounting that those are actually going to not only improve people's lives but also pay back to the government. So on that part of it, I think our suggestion is that the standard be relaxed. So that's my final comment.
I wouldn't relax it, but the way that we measure cost savings needs to be broadened, because here's another way you can have cost savings. Instead of spending $100 million where 90% of it does nothing, spend $80 million where 100% of it does something. So you both save money and you vastly improve outcomes. And that type of savings is not something that the current way the government works knows how to calculate. It's not the traditional cost-benefit type of savings, but it's every bit as real in my opinion.
Yeah, just to clarify, there is a debate in the pay-for-success community right now between whether the outcomes that the Pay-for-Success project is aiming for can be traced to measurable cost savings. Like, this baby has not gone to the emergency room with a child abuse-related injury. This kid has not gone to jail. And you can count that. That's one argument, which I think John was referring to. The other is that we are spending immense amounts of money on social programs already because we think that there's big problems in society that we're trying to solve. So, and then I'm going to ask you all to speak to this. George, this is what you're getting at. I just wanted to make sure people understand. So the idea there is, does it make sense for a pay-for-success project to be put into place when it's not the case that we are tracing it to some money we're saving? We're just doing something we wanted to do anyway, only better. Either we're more efficiently and more effectively. So this is a big debate, and I think it's unresolved at this point. You guys want to comment?
Please.
So very quickly, I think, Catherine, thank you for highlighting this debate, because it's really fundamental to the way how we design these projects and articulate the value proposition to state and local government. I think that on the latter approach, which is better outcomes or guaranteed outcomes for the same amount of money, it's extremely powerful. it's no accident that we haven't seen a K-12 application for social impact bonds, because the value is very diffuse. You can't really trace it fiscally to a particular line item. But we're beginning to experiment on the value to society front, the latter approach, in our work in Massachusetts. Just because people get more jobs and have higher earnings, the increased tax revenue cannot cover the cost of the program. So the fact that Charlie Baker's team is willing to pay for these improved outcomes, that the Massachusetts citizens are more productive, is an incredible mindset in thinking about pay for success. One last thing on the former approach, which is kind of very tight, precise fiscal savings. It's actually not that simple just to say, you know what, we need measurable savings. Our work on the ground has demonstrated that how do you think about savings that within the window of your project? Oftentimes, when we help people who are leaving prison to get a job and hold down the job, the benefits go beyond the 5 years that we're running the program. We call those out-of-year savings. How do you capture that? Do you NPV that savings back to today? As well as savings in different levels of government. The Congressman talked about the wrong pockets problem. A lot of the Medicaid savings are federal, state, and local level. And if the state is the commissioner of this project, how do we access the federal level savings? And then finally, the horizontal silo problem. Different agencies, when you help a homeless individual, the benefits accrue to housing and development, the criminal justice system, other TANF savings. So those are the different dimensions that it's definitely much more of an art than a science.
If I could add to that. I think this debate's a little bit a quirk of history. So here's what happened is that currently, the way laws are written, it's actually illegal to do pay for success. For existing spending streams, in many cases, the laws and regulations say one politician may not obligate some other politician in the future to pay something. So it has to be, you can't do, in other words, multi-year contingent obligations. And so for those of us who are trying to innovate this, what that forced us to do is to have all our early projects involve creating new spending streams. Well, how do you do that? Well, you ought to do a cost-benefit justification. So now the very exciting, and by the way, new spending streams small, existing spending streams very, very big. So the exciting thing that's happening now in this next phase of development is we are getting legislation that is, quote unquote, PFS enabling certain existing spending streams. So for example, 10% of the Workforce Innovation Act is now PFS enabled, which means that it is not against the law anymore to have these types of multi-year contingent obligations. What we'll find, I think, is that this debate will start to evaporate, that people will say, well, we're no longer trying to justify new spending, therefore we're not going to require cost-benefit justification of the old-fashioned type. Instead, what we're going to say is, can we spend less and get more, or can we spend the same and get more? Both of which will come from applying pay for success to existing spending streams. And then, of course, those existing spending streams being much, much larger than these protracted battles. The reason we are so tired is because we're not implementing just pay for success. And you too, I mean, you almost, I can't believe you lived over the last 6 months. But we're not just trying to do pay for success. Every time we do pay for success, we're also working with legislators to create a new spending stream in this environment, which is just really difficult.
Can I just say really quickly to add on to that? I think that's absolutely right. I have relaxed this standard a long time ago just because I realized pretty quickly, I think to John's original point, almost no deal is going to pencil on a purely sort of direct financial savings perspective. And it's for the reasons that Tracy noted, in addition to the fact that most of these remedial costs that we see in society are fixed costs. So you might keep even 100 people from going back to jail, which would be a really incredible result for a program. Doesn't mean you're going to close the jail down. Most of 99% of those costs are fixed. So you have to live with a lot of those at this scale. But I would say that government is in a position already of buying outcomes. I mean, that's what government does. It doesn't know what outcomes it's buying, and in most cases, it's probably not getting much value for the spending that it's doing. At least with this, even if you don't get pure cost savings to cover the cost of the program, at least government has certainty around what it's getting or what it's not getting, and then is shifting risk, performance risk and execution risk off to the private sector, which is significant.
Do you want to add anything, John? Or-
No, I think they've said it. I think the idea of looking at cost effectiveness, is given that the money is going out the door, is there a way to spend maybe a little bit less money or whatever, same amount of money, whatever, but do it in a way that's actually going to achieve the outcomes is sort of a larger concept that can work. I would just say that one of the problems with the strict benefit, sort of the strict benefit cost issue. I was talking. I heard this. So maybe I think this is true. I heard it from a reputable source, but that someone at NIH was saying that if you did a benefit cost calculation, a strict benefit cost calculation of childhood immunizations, it would not show. There would not be net savings to the government. Why? Because some of these children would die without the immunizations, and they wouldn't grow up to get heart disease and diabetes and all the rest, and end up costing people a lot of money. So, on the obviously,
cigarette cessation is the same story.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. So anyway, so this is encouraging. Maybe it's not such a debate in the Pay for Success community about how to do this.
Perhaps not. So I'm going to ask you each to respond quickly to the following question, and then we're gonna take questions from the audience. What do you see as the end game for Pay for Success? If we look ahead and we're living in 2030 and we're in Pay for Success utopia, what does that look like? I just want each of you to just say what that looks like, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Tracy?
It's a beautiful question, and sustainability is something that we think a lot about. Unfortunately, we don't have the data to say which way these projects will go. After a successful implementation of a PFS project, does government pick up these services and directly fund them over time? Would government do nothing? Would they refinance? I think that until we can attribute why we achieve results, is it simply the financing mechanism? Is it about the kind of discipline and the ongoing and sustained engagement by all the stakeholders over the project? I think we're really too early to tell. I mean, John has been advocating for evidence-based policymaking for decades. And government can just fund all the great evidence-based program, but an evidence-based program needs high-performing organizations to implement them. And that's why sometimes just because it's worked in one place with one population might not be able to be replicated in other places. So there's definitely intervention risk or model risk, which is where the evidence movement's about. And then there's also massive implementation risk. So until we know how to attribute Pay for Success, the success of Pay for Success, it's really hard to say where it would go. I hope the government would just directly fund all these programs and all of us work ourselves out of a job.
George, what is your utopia 20 years from now? What is the Pay
I
for
have seen the
Success
promised
field
land.
look
I've
like?
already seen glimpses of it.
Okay.
I'll say two things. One is I grew up in, of all things, the credit card industry, and the Fair Credit Reporting Act has made it possible to safely track the swipe of every credit card from every person in this room, and none of us has been hurt by that, but we've all been helped because it's also brought about a great democratization of credit around this country. I think that the utopia that we're headed towards is government side, I'll use jargon, government side embedded evaluation. And what I mean by that is, I'll give an example because I've already seen that. In the state of Illinois, there's a fellow named Mark Testa who some of us may know. He's an academic in the child welfare world. He went to Illinois and he built a way such that every time a baby comes up into the foster care system, there are 19 providers. And after determining which of the 19 providers are a geographic match and so forth, there's a randomization that takes place for every single time any baby's referred into the system. And then the system is also able to track automatically what the outcomes are for that young baby. How long are they in the system? How long does it take before they find a family? Do they show up at the hospital with certain problems? There are many, many things that can be captured. I asked him, how much does it cost to administer this thing? He said, well, it's about $60,000, $70,000 a year to have a permanent RCT that is ubiquitous, that makes it so that each of our 19 providers is measured using the same scorecard. It's not like everyone brings in their PhD who confuses the heck out of some policy person someplace, but it's instead a single embedded system. And what they haven't done yet in Illinois that I would like to see as part of the utopia is to, and you referred to this, is to link the results to that perpetual ongoing evaluation to the way the money's allocated. And that's what pay for success is. It doesn't have to be 100% of the money. Even if only 15% of any given contract had that element to it, I think the incentive system will be created and the transparency and the feedback loop will be embedded. That allows that march of progress to take place over time. There's a quiet revolution going on in aggregating data. If you take a look at the National Student Clearinghouse, and it's, what is it, 90%? I don't know what percent of all students in college now.
Oh, 95%.
All right, 95% of all students attending a university or a college in this country are captured in a single database that can be safely accessed with privacy, and the privacy legislation's intact, and it's a government database. It should not, in my view, it should not be private side. These should be government side so that the safekeeping is there. And it's going to unleash tremendous innovation, in my view.
Jeremy?
So I guess, some of us in the industry have this notion of, the fact that we're creating a new asset class, and that eventually, pension funds, TIAA CREF will eventually invest in, social impact bonds. My 74-year-old mother, will sit at home and day trade in, homelessness impact bonds from her living room. And that, that's interesting to think about for a minute. That's not what I find compelling, and I don't actually care whether that sort of figures into this vision of utopia. I think what's more compelling for me is the idea that we actually have a performance-based social sector. And my hope is that what this pay for success, what the leading edge of this curve is really going to result in is, a group of providers and social entrepreneurs and others that have the ability and the capacity to demonstrably and measurably account for their impact in the community. And then my theory is that the funding sector will align around those organizations. Because they are, there was so many, John Delaney talked about the 50-year, or maybe it was Congressman Young, the 50-year war on poverty. There is so much fatigue on the funder side, both government and philanthropy, about these problems and our inability to sort of solve problems where in almost any other sector or discipline we have been extremely successful over the last 50 years. So I think there's an enormous appetite among funders to find interventions that are successful, that are actually having the impact that we would hope for. And I think that it's this virtuous cycle of good organizations getting the capacity to do this, funders aligning around those organizations, supporting their work, further scaling, and so on and so on. That's my vision.
And my vision is of utopia. Pay for success utopia is a lot of pay for success projects going on and finding positive impacts on important outcomes. So let me just say why I think that is the hoped for outcome, and it's challenging to get there. So I served on the board of the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research arm of the Department of Education, when it started, when the Institute was created back in 2002. And there was new legislation prioritizing randomized controlled trials. There was a head of IES that was Russ Whitehurst, who was an experimental psychologist, and for the first time, the Department of Education was going to be funding these big randomized field experiments to figure out what works and what doesn't work in school choice programs and curricula and teacher training and so on. And the hope was that they'd identify some things that work and could be scaled up, and some things that didn't work, but those things that did work would provide the critical missing piece, the critical knowledge needed to improve American education. Didn't quite turn out that way. Those trials went forward. There were some great studies. Close to 90% of them found weak or no effects for the program that was being evaluated compared to what schools were doing anyway. And there just haven't been a body of interventions, things that work. So it is, and I think that's a lesson that is important for Pay for Success to learn from, which is that it is challenging, more challenging, I think, than is commonly recognized, to identify interventions that produce meaningful impacts. So I think for Pay for Success to succeed, to get to that utopia, you have to have that. You have to have positive impacts. You can have some and a reasonable number of failures, but you have to have some things that show success.
All right, thanks so much, you guys. Questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Gibson. I'm with Apple Tree Institute for Education and Innovation. And I have been a part of, in another sector, some attempts at deals. And they're really hard. But it seems like the weak link, which I'm curious to see what sort of movement has been, is in the nonprofit, in the service provider, that feels like the part of the triangle that is too busy, too stressed, or what we'll end up having is a sort of 1% problem, where 1% of nonprofits can do it. But by and large, we're missing opportunities. So, Jeremy, you said some interesting things, and I'm just curious to see, is there any effort to move this downstream a bit?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start. So absolutely agree with you 100%. One of the key sort of platforms or pillars of the center that I run at the University of Utah focuses on building the capacity of the nonprofit sector. And there are other groups out there, Nonprofit Finance Fund. I think Social Finance has done some of this work. The Third Sector has as well. But really recognizing the kind of critical role that third, leg of the stool plays. And there has been sort of in the last several years a lot of focus and attention directed toward government. That's warranted. Government needs a lot of help with this too. But then to expect nonprofits to go from sort of the anecdote level of reporting that they're doing now to saying, okay, we're having a 10% decrease on the homeless population or the homeless problem in our community overnight is totally unrealistic. And so it's a question of sort of helping those organizations implement the data systems in particular. When you talk to nonprofits, they will tell you that they collect good program data in a lot of cases about their program, and it's pre and post. This person looked like this coming in, they look like this coming out. But the data relationships that they have with administrative partners, with government agencies, so that they can sort of understand how those people fare, years down the road, is like non-existent. And so helping those groups develop those relationships, put those agreements in place, think about the performance management techniques so that when data does roll out of a program, they can continuously improve processes, and the program itself is hugely important. And there's it's just totally undercapitalized and underfunded because funders they haven't recognized the value in it yet.
Yeah.
My name's Lou Enoff. I'm an independent consultant, mostly in the disability area, and I have a question for John, I think. Where do you find the evaluators? Who selects them, and how do you oversee that evaluation process? In the federal government, the evaluation process is a problem.
Well, these folks can talk to Pay for Success, how the evaluators are found better than I can because they've been through the process. I do know that in our work, we fund a lot of evaluations, randomized field trials. Our foundation is increasing our investment there. And a lot of studies fall apart. Maybe more than half of rigorous studies fall apart and turn into something less rigorous, in some cases something not producing any valid answer as they go forward. So the thing that we generally do in funding trials is to ask each proposed evaluator, proposed researcher, to send us a copy of their prior studies. We require that there be a person on the research team who has done a well-conducted randomized trial before, and we ask for a copy of the study and we review it. Because it's something that researchers often, it's outside many of their experiences. They're used to crunching data at a desk, but actually to go out and implement something in the field and keep the treatment group separate, that's an organizational challenge, very different from what many of them are expert in. So, but these guys can probably answer the question about how it's been done in Pay for Success better than I can.
We are so tight for time. I think we have time for one more question. We have a few minutes afterwards if you guys want to speak to the panelists individually. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hello, I'm Raphael Vigier. I work for the French Embassy. And my question is about the investors. How do you get people to fund these programs besides philanthropy? Because as you said, it's kind of hard to get measurable income because it benefits each of us. So what are they and how do you get them to fund those programs besides philanthropy?
We might start with philanthropy and then build from there. For philanthropists, this is a spectacular new product. Think of it. If you have $1 million and you want to pay for a program you like, you might make it possible for 500 young people to be served. And then a year later, you'll get a thank you letter. And then about 3 weeks later, you'll get a letter that says, may we have another $1 million. Under this model, the same philanthropist writes a $1 million check. It's immediately doubled by banks. So now it's 2 million. So now 1,000 young people are served. And at the end, instead of a thank you letter, they get a randomized controlled trial result. And if it works, their money is then redeployed. So they get not 1,000, but 1,000 followed by 1,000, followed by 1,000, followed by 1,000, and so on forever. It is spectacularly better than traditional philanthropy. And my bet is that given the huge growth, we just had one of our colleagues, Edna McConnell Clark, announced a $1 billion raise of philanthropic dollars out there. And our ability to absorb that money, I mean, $1 billion would go a very long ways. So I'm a believer that ultimately 2 things will happen. You have projects that are either fully philanthropically funded because it's such a spectacular return, or the results will be so surefire that any old bank would say, well, that's just working capital. You've done this a bunch of times already, so it just looks like a working capital loan, or maybe a little bit more expensive than that. But currently we have kind of this esoteric middle ground that we're working with, and I believe it's going to float away over time.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and philanthropy has played a very catalytic role in getting the sector going. A lot of the projects are funded by philanthropy, but I'm cautious that this should never replace philanthropy. Philanthropy has a very important role to test R&D, to capacity build organizations, to test new ideas, and there's always a place for philanthropy. And what we're hoping to do, and I think our New York State project with the Center for Employment Opportunities, this is a job-based program for people who are leaving prison. That particular fundraising model is just incredibly exciting, and we're hoping to replicate. What we did was partner with Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and to do a private placement, a securities offering that their brokers and their financial advisors sold to their clients. It came in around a $250,000 piece, so a highly democratic distribution, lots of people holding this piece of investment, 45 investors, the average investment size, again, $250,000, and unlocked a different group of people who may not have heard of CEO, the provider, may not be part of the criminal justice dialogue. And I would quote Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary. He's one of our investors in the CEO New York State deal. He said, you know what, I have 2 choices. I can put it in my philanthropic vehicle, my tax-exempt vehicle, whether it's a family foundation or a donor advised fund. I can put it in my regular investment portfolio. And he chose the latter because he thought that this had 0 correlation to anything else in that portfolio, and lack of correlation is something that people look for. Now, at the end of the day, he is philanthropically motivated because the kind of return that one would get is not commensurate with the risk. But this is, I think we need both kinds of capital, and over time we'll see how it shakes out.
All right, well, I want to thank you guys so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. I wish we had more time. If you could, we have a special guest who, Mark Shriver, who is here on behalf of Save the Children, which is co-sponsoring this event with us. Mark Shriver has deep engagement with early childhood, which is my field. So he's going to offer closing remarks on how he sees the pay for success model furthering our work in early childhood. So before he comes up, I want to thank our panel. Thanks so much, you guys. All right, thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Catherine. I know I'm the last person between everyone getting out of here, so I will be mercifully very brief. I want to thank Catherine so much for the great work that she has done, and I guess it was Jeremy who mentioned the Dream Team, right? So I just want to say that it's tough to follow the Dream Team from Congressman Young and Congressman Delaney. Nobody's hearing me? There we go. Can we start all over? No. Good. Just very briefly, just want to thank Arthur and the team here at AEI and the panelists for their great comments here. I am incredibly excited about not only this event here at AEI, but the whole movement. I mean, I think, we've heard a number of times from the panelists about how complicated it is. And it is complicated, make no bones about it. But the bottom line is we're on the cusp of a potential revolution to change the way funding for social services happens. Catherine mentioned the efforts and the interest that Save the Children has on early childhood education. And I just want to reemphasize again that was part of the Pay for Success legislation that came out of the House. It is not part of the Senate, so it is still an issue that needs a lot of attention, that needs focus. Young kids don't get the resources, they don't get the services that they so need in order to enter kindergarten ready to learn. They get forgotten too often. We heard of a number of examples about recidivism, about keeping families together, about workforce development. But what our emphasis is at Save the Children is on kids that are youngest and most vulnerable, kids that are 18 months behind by the age of 4, those kids living in poverty. I'd just say one last thing. My father started the war on poverty. Congressman Young talked about it. A number of the panelists talked about it, about the number of failures that are in the war on poverty. So it struck a little chord with me. But I do want to just say that when John Barron mentioned that it doesn't mean that all the efforts within the war on poverty are failures. I think if you ask my father, when he started the war on poverty 50-plus years ago, whether he thought it would look exactly the same as they designed it in 1965 as it would in 2016, he would have said absolutely not. That I think when he created it was the idea that you had to start something, but you had to be innovative, not only on the funding, but on the actual design of those programs. So I think if anybody in here thought or thinks that the way it was set up 50 years ago is the way it should happen and be implemented today, given the incredible rapid change, they are sorely mistaken. So I think it's an incredible achievement to be 50 years into the war on poverty, but that we all ought to retask ourselves to be more innovative in the financing, to be more innovative in the support and the development of nonprofits that are stretched so thin in many cases, because they're implementing these services. So today we ought to see this as an incredible opportunity and an incredible challenge for the next 50 years. So thank you again, Catherine. I'll thank Arthur when I see him tonight. He's my next door neighbor, as he mentioned. And thank you all, the panelists, for coming from all around the country. This is an incredibly exciting moment in the development of services and in the development, especially of focusing in on taking care of our most vulnerable, youngest citizens. Thank you very much.
I think the panelists will be around for a few minutes if any of you want to touch base with them individually.